The drill went quiet at 14 minutes past 7 on a Tuesday morning, and before Camille Whitaker could ask what was happening, her stepmother's hand closed on the back of her neck and shoved her out the door. She was 27, barefoot, still in the faded scrubs she'd worn through a double shift at the nursing home, and she caught herself on one knee on the cold concrete of the driveway. "She's yours," Yvonne said behind her. "That's it, we're square." When Camille looked up, she was standing 2 feet from a man she'd never seen in her life. He didn't step back. He didn't reach out to help her either. 2 black SUVs sat across the driveway with their engines still running. 4 men stood in a loose half-circle in the yard, and not one of them moved, because every one of them was waiting on him. He was maybe 34. Dark hair cut short, gray eyes, a thin scar along the left side of his jaw, and in his hand was a folded contract her stepmother had signed less than a minute earlier. His eyes went from Camille's face down to the frayed cuffs of her scrubs, and back up again. Not cruel, not hungry, just the look of a man checking whether the merchandise matched the paperwork. And that was when Camille noticed the strangest thing about that morning. The collector who'd been doing all the talking took his hat off the second he recognized who'd pulled into that driveway. Yvonne, who'd been shouting a minute earlier, went completely silent. Whoever this man was, the people who'd come to take her were afraid of him. Nobody standing in that yard knew what he was about to do next. Camille least of all. If stories about ordinary people who refuse to be broken mean something to you, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because we tell these stories every week. Now let's go back to that driveway in Brayton, Pennsylvania, where a woman stood barefoot in the cold and waited to hear what she'd just been traded for. The man said nothing for a long time. He opened the contract with both hands, slowly, the way someone might open something fragile, then lowered his head and began to read. No one in the yard dared breathe too loudly. Camille remained on one knee against the concrete, both feet numb from the cold, and she realized she could hear the wind slipping through the fence behind the house, the engines of the 2 vehicles still running steadily, and the soft rustle of paper when he turned the page over. He read longer than should have been necessary for a document containing only a few paragraphs. The debt collector stood several paces away and began shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He opened his mouth as though he intended to say something, then stopped. Yvonne stood framed in the doorway with one hand gripping the doorframe. Camille didn't turn to look, but she knew her stepmother was watching, because she could feel that gaze against the back of her neck, like the hand that had just pushed her outside. At last, the man looked up. He didn't look at the debt collector, at Yvonne, or at the 4 men waiting in the middle of the yard. He looked directly at Camille and asked a question in such an ordinary voice that it startled her more than a shout would have. He asked whether she had signed the document with her own hand. Camille opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked at the paper he was holding, at the crooked signature at the bottom of the page that she immediately recognized as Yvonne's handwriting, and understood that this was the first time in her life anyone had asked whether she agreed. He wasn't asking whether she could do it. He wasn't asking whether she could carry one more burden. He was asking whether she wanted it. Her voice sounded dry and unfamiliar when it emerged. She said she hadn't even known the document existed. The man gave a very slight nod, as though he had already known the answer and needed only to hear her speak it with her own mouth. Then he folded the contract, took hold of both edges, and tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper carried clearly through the yard. He tore it again, then once more, and dropped the pieces onto the concrete at his feet. The wind sent 2 scraps rolling toward the nearest SUV. The debt collector stepped forward half a pace and said the debt had been transferred legally, that there was a signature and a witness, and that his company was merely performing the work it had been hired to do. The man turned toward him. He didn't raise his voice, make a threat, or speak a single harsh word. He merely said that as of that morning, the debt was in his name, and told the collector to return to whoever had sent him and say that if there were any questions, they could come and ask him directly. The debt collector remained still for several seconds. Then he put on his hat, turned, and walked straight to his vehicle without looking at anyone. Camille saw his hand trembling as he opened the door. The man turned toward Yvonne. She had stepped fully onto the porch and stood with both hands gripping her elbows, and she began speaking very quickly. She said she had been left with no other choice, that she had been struggling to manage for so long, that the girl was young and healthy, and that this arrangement was only temporary. The man allowed her to finish. Then he told her that she owed him, not her daughter, and that she would hear from his people. He said nothing more. He turned away. The 4 men in the yard immediately separated and returned to the 2 vehicles without waiting for a signal. Doors closed. Engines roared. Before getting into his vehicle, the man paused for exactly 1 beat and looked at Camille, still kneeling on the cold concrete. Then he removed his coat and placed it on the hood of her car, which was parked beside the fence. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't tell her to put it on. He simply left it there, climbed into the vehicle, and departed. The 2 SUVs backed out of the driveway, turned around at the end of the road, and disappeared beyond the curve. The yard suddenly became so quiet that Camille could hear the old heater running inside the house. She stood. Her knee hurt, and 1 leg of her pants was dark with moisture. Torn pieces of paper lay scattered across the concrete at her feet. 1 scrap bearing Yvonne's signature turned upward toward the sky. Camille bent down, picked it up, and turned it between her fingers, realizing she still had no idea what the document had said. She looked up toward the porch. Yvonne had gone inside. The door was closed. Camille stepped onto the porch and inserted her key into the lock, as she had done every day for years, but it wouldn't go in more than halfway. She pulled it out, looked at it, then tried again, more slowly and carefully, as though the problem lay in her hand rather than the door. The new lock gleamed without a single scratch, and she remembered the sound of drilling early that morning. The noise she had assumed came from someone repairing something out on the street. She knocked. No one answered. She knocked again and called her stepmother's name through the frosted glass beside the door, and she saw a figure stop at the far end of the hallway inside. The figure remained still for a long time. Then Yvonne's voice came through the glass, quiet and muffled, saying she was sorry. That was all. No explanation, no open door, not 1 step closer. Camille pressed a hand against the glass and asked what she had done, what she had signed, and whether she knew where those people had nearly taken her. The figure inside retreated. Then the hallway light went out. Camille stood with her hand still pressed against the cold glass, staring into the house she had cleaned every weekend, and whose electric bills she had paid through all the winters when her stepmother said money was tight, and she realized that for the first time in her life, she was looking at it from the outside. She turned away and nearly tripped over them. 2 black plastic bags sat against the edge of the porch, their tops knotted and their shapes swollen and uneven. She bent down, opened one, and found her clothes stuffed inside in haste. 1 shoe tangled with a shirt, her notebook of work shifts folded in half. The other contained a blanket, a pillow, and a framed photograph of her father lying face down at the bottom. She took out the frame, turned it over, and saw a diagonal crack running across his face. Camille sat on the front step with the photograph in her lap until darkness had fully fallen, and the cold had passed through the thin fabric of her uniform. She didn't cry. She simply sat there until she could no longer feel her hands. Then she carried the 2 plastic bags to her car, placed them on the back seat, and sat behind the wheel. The coat was still lying on the hood. She brought it inside, folded it, and placed it on the seat beside her without putting it on. The following morning, she still went to work. She washed her face in the restroom of a gas station, changed into a clean uniform taken from one of the plastic bags, tied back her hair, and arrived at Rosewood Manor before the shift handoff. No one asked any questions. Mornings there always began with the same tasks. Camille walked along the eastern hallway knowing Mr. Pruitt would demand that the curtains be opened before he agreed to sit up, that Mrs. Hetty drank her tea only when the water had turned very dark and would push the cup away if it was pale, and that Mr. Fenwick couldn't bear the sound of a door closing hard, so she always kept one hand against his door until it shut completely. She knew who needed to hear their name twice before turning around, who wanted someone to hold their hand while their blood pressure was taken, and who pretended to be asleep to avoid taking medication. None of those things appeared on the assignment sheet. They were what she had learned by staying, shift after shift, until those people had become more familiar to her than the home that had just locked her outside. At the end of the hallway was Adelaide Quinn's room. She was 83 years old, and on some days she remembered every detail, while on others she couldn't remember which day of the week it was. Camille entered, opened the curtains, and Adelaide turned her head against the pillow and studied her for a long time. Then she smiled and said, "I knew you would come, Josephine. Sit down beside me for a while." Camille paused for a moment. She pulled the chair closer to the bed, sat down, and took the old woman's thin, dry hand. She didn't correct her. She only asked whether she had slept well the night before, and Adelaide began telling a story about some summer long ago in some distant place, her voice slow and peaceful. For those 15 minutes, Camille didn't think about the new lock, the 2 black plastic bags in the trunk of her car, or where she would sleep that night. When her afternoon shift ended, Camille drove straight to the Brayton police station with her notebook and the documents she had dug from the bottom of the black plastic bag. She had spent her lunch break sitting in the car, arranging them in order, and everything seemed perfectly clear in her mind. Someone had signed a document offering her in exchange for money. Someone had changed the locks on her home. 4 men had stood in her yard at 7 o'clock in the morning. Those weren't things that could happen in a country governed by law, and she believed that if someone would only listen to the entire story, everything would be handled. The police station was small, with an old vinyl floor and a ceiling fan, turning slowly above the public service desk. The officer on duty was named Halloran. His hair was silver at the temples, and he poured her a cup of water before she could begin. He listened from beginning to end, without interrupting once. He took notes. He asked her to clarify 2 places where her explanation had become uncertain. Then he asked permission to take the documents, put on his glasses, and began typing at the computer. Camille watched him work. He typed for a long time. He opened 1 page, closed it, opened another, then leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. And from that gesture alone, Camille knew things weren't going to unfold the way she had expected. He asked whether she knew whose name was currently on the deed to the house. She gave him her father's name. He shook his head very slightly. He turned the screen toward her, pointed to 1 line, and explained that the house had been foreclosed upon and transferred to a company nearly a year earlier, that every required procedure had been completed, that notice had been sent by registered mail to the official address, and that someone at that address had signed for it. Camille stared at the words on the screen without being able to read any of them. She asked who had signed the receipt. Officer Halloran didn't answer. He merely looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that kept her from asking a second time. She remained silent for a while, then asked about the other document, the one her stepmother had signed that morning, the one saying Camille had to work for someone to repay a debt. Halloran asked whether she had the original. She shook her head. She told him it had been torn apart in the yard. He asked who had torn it. She said she didn't know the man's name. He wrote that down, then set aside his pen, and spoke in the voice of someone who had been forced to give this explanation many times and had never grown accustomed to it. He said that, based on what she had described, it had been a civil document, that an adult signing a financial commitment on behalf of another person wasn't in itself a criminal act, and that without the original, without a recording, without a witness willing to testify, and most importantly, without any actual act of coercion having occurred against her, he didn't have sufficient grounds to open a case. Camille said they had come to her home. He said they had arrived, spoken, and left. Camille said she had been pushed out the door. He asked whether she had been injured, whether anyone had seen it, and whether anyone was willing to sign a statement. Camille thought of the hedge beside the house, of all the closed windows along the street at 7 o'clock in the morning, and said nothing. Halloran folded the documents and pushed them back toward her. He said he would record everything in the intake log, and that if anyone contacted her, called her, or appeared at her workplace, she should call him immediately. Then he wrote his direct number on the back of a business card. He added something he didn't have to say. He said he was very sorry, and that some things were lawful while still feeling deeply wrong, but his job allowed him to act only on the question of legality. Camille took the documents and the business card, thanked him, and left. She walked through the station's glass doors, carrying exactly what she had brought inside. That night, she parked in the farthest corner of the lot behind Rosewood Manor, where the light reached just far enough to keep the darkness from becoming complete. She reclined the seat, covered herself with the blanket from the plastic bag, and folded the coat beneath her head. She opened her telephone. The final message from Nolan Reyes was still there, read but never answered. She looked at his name on the screen for a while without opening the message, then switched off the telephone and placed it face down on the seat beside her. 3 nights in the car. By the 4th, Camille could no longer tell whether she was exhausted because she hadn't slept properly or because of something else. Every morning, she had to sit still inside the car for a while before opening the door, and whenever she stood too quickly, the entire parking lot tilted for a moment before setting itself upright again. She drank gas station coffee instead of eating breakfast and felt nauseated throughout the morning. She assumed it was the coffee. She stopped drinking it and remained nauseated. She decided it was anxiety. She told herself everything would be fine once she found somewhere to live. That morning, she entered Adelaide's room earlier than usual to change the sheets. The old woman was sitting in the chair by the window, telling a story about apple trees, while Camille listened and pulled the old sheet free from the four corners of the mattress. She bent down to tuck the edge of the clean sheet beneath the lowest corner. When she stood, the room turned completely white. She heard Adelaide calling someone's name. Then she heard nothing. She woke beneath a row of ceiling lights and needed a moment to understand that she was lying down rather than standing. A machine sounded steadily to her left. There was an IV needle in the back of her hand. A pale blue curtain surrounded the bed. She tried to sit up, and a nurse gently placed a hand on her shoulder and told her to remain still. Camille asked what time it was, who was looking after Adelaide, and who had taken her afternoon shift. The nurse said someone had already called the nursing home and told her to rest. A while later, the curtain was drawn aside and a woman entered wearing a badge that read Renata Vogel. She pulled up a chair and sat at Camille's eye level instead of standing at the foot of the bed. She asked how Camille had been eating lately. Camille said she had been eating normally. Dr. Vogel asked again, more specifically, what she had eaten for dinner the night before and the night before that. Camille fell silent. Dr. Vogel nodded. She said the blood work showed that Camille was anemic and physically depleted, that this was why she had fainted, and that the problem needed to be addressed with proper food and supplements, not willpower. Then she paused. She asked whether Camille knew she was pregnant. Camille heard every word clearly. She also heard the machine to her left continuing its steady sound. She looked at Dr. Vogel and said nothing. The doctor continued calmly, saying the results indicated that the pregnancy was several weeks along, that everything appeared normal for now, and that the most important thing was for Camille to eat, sleep, and attend regular appointments. She asked whether Camille had anyone who could bring her and take her home. Camille didn't answer that question. Dr. Vogel wrote several lines, said she would return later, and drew the curtain closed behind her. Camille lay still. She stared at the ceiling. Then she began counting backward. She counted from the present day, past the 3 nights in the car, past the afternoon at the police station, past the morning when she heard the drill, past the weeks when she worked 2 shifts and returned home before dawn, and she stopped at the night Nolan had stood in the doorway with a bag over his shoulder, saying the debt wasn't his, and that he couldn't begin a life by paying what was owed to a dead man. She remembered that she hadn't asked him to stay. She remembered standing there until she heard his car disappear beyond the end of the street. And now, lying on a hospital bed with an IV needle in the back of her hand, she counted again and understood that the baby had already been there before that night. The baby had been there when he carried his bag away. It had been there while she listened to the sound of his car fading into the distance. It had been there all along, without anyone knowing. Camille placed her free hand against her stomach. She remained that way. The tears running into her hair at her temples weren't for the baby. They came because she had just understood that at 7:14 on Tuesday morning, when her stepmother's hand pushed her out the door and a voice behind her said the debt could now be considered paid, it hadn't been only one person offered as payment. There had been 2, and in that entire yard filled with men that morning, not one person in the world had known, not even her. The hospital discharged her the following afternoon with a prescription and a return appointment notice. Camille sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, opened the black plastic bag on the back seat, took out her notebook, and turned to the page where she had tucked the scrap of paper she found in the yard. The piece was no larger than her palm, with ragged, torn edges, and it contained no signature or terms, only the top of a page printed with a company name and an address in South Philadelphia. She had carried it for several days without daring to examine it closely. Now she looked. She thought about the 2 plastic bags in the trunk, the prescription that would cost money to fill, and how many more nights a pregnant woman could sleep inside a car. And she thought that she needed to know exactly what she still owed and to whom, because she could never finish paying a debt whose shape she couldn't see. She drove away. The address led her to an old street lined with red brick buildings, and the number on the paper belonged to a restaurant that had been closed for years, its windows covered with newspaper and its sign faded. Camille parked across the street and sat there for nearly an hour. People entered and left through a side passage. No one appeared to be in a hurry. At last, she opened the car door, crossed the street, and stood at the entrance to the passage, with her notebook held against her chest. A middle-aged man asked whom she was looking for. She said she wanted to see the man who had come to Brayton on Tuesday morning. The man studied her for a moment, told her to wait, then went inside. It was a long time before he returned. Camille waited outside in the cold of late March until the other man emerged from the passage. He still wore dark clothing, still had no hat, and still walked like someone who had never needed to hurry. He didn't appear surprised to see her, nor did he ask how she had come or where she had found the address. Camille immediately said what she had rehearsed in her mind for the entire hour. She wasn't asking for anything. She only wanted to know how much she still owed and whom she had to repay, and she would repay it, even if it took the rest of her life. The man listened until she finished. Then he said she didn't owe him a cent. Camille said her stepmother had signed. He said her stepmother had signed, not Camille. She began to answer, but he had already walked past her, crossed the street, and approached her old car. He looked at the 2 black plastic bags on the back seat, the hastily folded blanket, and the pillow arranged against the driver's seat. He didn't ask a single question about any of it. He took a ring of keys from his coat pocket and placed it on the hood, in the same place where he had left his coat several days earlier. He gave her an address and said it was an empty apartment in a building owned by his company. On the 2nd floor, at the last door in the hallway. No one lived there, and no one visited it. Then he said she could leave whenever she wanted. No one would keep her there, and there was nothing to repay. Camille shook her head. She said she wouldn't accept it. She had already had one woman sign a paper on her behalf, and she wouldn't allow anyone else to decide for her again, even if the decision was meant as kindness. He watched her for a long time. Then he nodded, the same slight nod she had seen in the yard. He didn't pick up the keys. He left them on the hood, turned, and walked back into the passage beside the restaurant without saying anything more. Camille stood alone beside her car on the wind-blown street. She picked up the keys, intending to throw them after him, then opened the car door and tossed them into the glove compartment. She slept in the car that night. She did the same the next night. On the 3rd night, she woke near dawn because of the cold, and sat silently in the darkness for a long time, with one hand resting against her stomach. Then she opened the glove compartment. The apartment was small and empty, with one bed, one table, and a window overlooking the brick wall of the neighboring building. Camille stood in the middle of the room with the keys in her hand and thought about how someone had written her price on a sheet of paper, and how everyone in that crowded yard that morning had treated that number as real. No one in the world had the right to do that. She stood there for a very long time before setting the 2 plastic bags on the floor. Camille slept in that apartment for exactly 1 night, and the following morning she woke with an unbearable feeling inside her chest. It wasn't fear, it was debt. She lay staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to water moving through pipes somewhere inside the walls, and thought that if she remained there for 1 more night, she would never again have the right to tell anyone that she belonged to no one. She folded the blanket, gathered the 2 plastic bags, and drove back to the red brick street with the keys in her coat pocket. No one was guarding the passage beside the restaurant that day. The wooden door at the far end stood partly open. Camille entered, passed through an old kitchen that was no longer used, and stopped where the hallway turned because she heard voices in the room beyond. She was about to call out. Then she heard the first sentence and remained silent. The door to the room stood open about the width of a hand. Inside was a long table beneath a low-hanging light, with several men sitting silently around it. The man from Tuesday morning sat at the head. An envelope lay before him. He pushed it toward a younger man seated several chairs away, whose hands rested on the table and who didn't dare look up. The man at the head of the table didn't shout or strike the table. He spoke in the voice of someone reading back a shopping list. He said he knew the younger man had taken money from Kestrel. He knew where the money had gone, what the man had borrowed it to pay for, and whom he had paid. The younger man began speaking very quickly, his voice breaking in the middle of a sentence. The man at the head of the table allowed him to finish. Then he continued in the same voice, saying there was only one thing the younger man had done right throughout the entire matter. He hadn't lied to his wife. The man said he knew that, and it was the only reason the younger man would leave the room on his own 2 feet. Then he told him to pick up the envelope. The younger man did. His hands trembled so badly that he had to hold the envelope between both palms. The man continued, saying there was enough inside for him to leave, that he was never to return, and that if the man ever heard his name spoken by someone else again, their next conversation wouldn't include an envelope. The younger man rose, placed his keys on the table, and left through the door on the opposite side. No one in the room turned to watch him go. Camille stood in the hallway with one hand gripping the edge of the wall. Inside the room, the man at the head of the table pulled his chair closer and moved to the second matter. He said that beginning that day, the entire debt collection operation was closed, not suspended, closed. Every active case would stop, every signed contract would be canceled, and no one was to accept another file from anywhere. A chair scraped against the floor. A middle-aged man seated near the center of the table spoke. He said this would mean abandoning most of the family's income, that dozens of people depended on that money, that the current year had already been difficult, and the next would be worse, and that if they stopped doing the work, someone else would take it over and grow stronger. He spoke for quite a while. The man at the head of the table allowed him to finish without interrupting once or changing his posture. When the man stopped, the room became so quiet that Camille could hear the light buzzing above the table. Then the man at the head asked him one question. He said his father had given him a name and a seat at this table, and asked whether he now wanted him to sell human beings in order to keep them. No one answered. The middle-aged man remained seated for a long time with both palms flat on the table. Then he rose on his own, pushed his chair back into place, and walked out without assistance. No one looked after him. No one spoke. Only the buzzing light remained. Camille stepped back half a pace, and her shoe touched the base of the wall. The sound was very small, but the man at the head of the table turned immediately and looked directly through the opening in the door, toward the place where she stood, gripping the keys so tightly that they pressed into her flesh. He didn't ask how long she had been standing there. He didn't ask what she had heard. He simply looked at her. And for the first time since that morning in the yard, Camille understood that the man who had saved her and the man who had just sat at the head of that table were the same person. She couldn't return the keys. She remained in the doorway for one more beat, then turned and walked away, through the old kitchen and out the side passage, and she drove the entire distance back to Brayton without turning on the radio. The keys remained in her coat pocket. She didn't understand why she hadn't placed them on the table when she had the chance, and she didn't dare examine the reason too closely. That afternoon, she reported for her shift as usual. She pushed the medication cart along the eastern hallway, stopping at each room and performing tasks so familiar to her hands that they required nothing from the part of her mind still spinning. At the end of the corridor, she entered Adelaide's room and found the old woman sitting beside the window with her back straighter than usual and both hands resting in her lap. Adelaide turned, looked at her, and called her by the correct name. Camille stopped in the doorway. The old woman said her mind was very clear today, clear as water, and she didn't know whether it would remain that way tomorrow. So she wanted to talk. Camille pulled the chair closer and sat down. Adelaide looked out the window for a while, then began to tell her story. She said her family had once owned a piece of land bordering the property next door, and between the two properties lay a narrow strip of ground her father had wanted for years. She said that during the spring when she was Camille's age, perhaps even younger, her father and the neighbor sat together on the back porch for an entire afternoon, and by evening, everything had been settled. She learned what they had decided from the voices drifting in from the porch. No one called her outside to ask her a single question. The wedding took place the following month. She said the man never struck her, never starved her, and never did anything that would make outsiders interfere, and she remained with him until he died. Then she fell silent for a long time. Camille asked nothing. Adelaide continued in the same calm voice, saying that throughout most of the life that followed, she believed it must have been her fault. She thought she hadn't been valuable enough for her father to feel regret. That belief remained inside her for so long that she could no longer distinguish it from herself. She said it was only much later, when all her hair had turned white and her father had been in the ground for many years, that one day, while folding clothes, she suddenly understood. She understood that the wrongness hadn't been in her. The wrongness had been in that afternoon when two men sat on a back porch and believed they had the right to do what they had done. It had taken her nearly an entire lifetime to understand that, and she mourned all the years she had spent believing the opposite. Camille sat silently. She looked down at her hands clasped in her lap and saw that they were trembling. Adelaide slowly reached out and took one of them. Her hand was dry and light, but her grip was strong, far stronger than Camille had imagined someone of her age could manage. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't say she knew. She simply held Camille's hand, and after a while, she said that if anyone ever wrote a price beside your name, you must find the person holding the pen and question them, not the mirror. Then she stopped. She said nothing more. She turned back toward the window, where the afternoon light was slowly settling across the lawn, and the two women remained there holding hands until the sound of a medication cart rolled past in the hallway, and Camille had to rise and finish her work. That night shift ended later than usual, And when Camille pushed through the back door into the parking lot, she saw a car parked along the circular drive out front, its lights off, with a man leaning against the door. She recognized the way he stood before she recognized his face. She stopped in the middle of the lawn. He didn't come any closer. He only asked if she was finished with work. Camille said she still had to sign the shift report. He nodded and said he could wait. She went back inside, signed the book, spoke with the night attendant longer than necessary, and when she came out again, he was still standing in exactly the same place. She walked over and pulled the keys from her coat pocket, saying she had come to return them the other day but hadn't managed to, and now she was giving them back. He didn't take them. He looked over her shoulder toward the low building, where a row of dull yellow windows ran along the eastern corridor, and asked if the rooms at the far end on the other side were the ones overlooking the lawn. Camille said yes. He was silent for a while. Then he said his mother had once lived in the last room along that hall. Camille stood perfectly still. He went on in an ordinary voice, neither fast nor slow, like a man talking about the weather. He said she had lived there for nearly a year. He said that when they first brought her in, she could still talk, still ask questions, still scold him for never eating properly. Then, little by little, she spoke less. Then she stopped calling him by name. Then one day she asked him who he was. He paused there, not because he was overcome with emotion, but as if he were checking to make sure he had remembered the order correctly. He said he had visited very few times during that year. He didn't explain why. He only said that whenever he came, he saw the same young woman sitting in the chair beside his mother's bed. Camille could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. He said the young woman used to read the newspaper to her, not books, old newspapers, wrinkled copies people had left behind in the common room. She read the weather, the town news, even the classified ads. He said he couldn't understand why anyone would read classified ads to a woman who no longer knew where she was. He said it was only much later that he understood she read them, because that section was the longest. Camille raised a hand to cover her mouth. He said that the last time he came, his mother hadn't turned her head when he walked in. The young woman had been sitting in that same chair, reading, and she stopped to ask if he wanted to sit down. He said he told her he was only stopping by. He said he stood in the doorway for a few minutes, then left. He said that was the last time he ever saw his mother. Camille shook her head. She said she didn't remember. She said she had sat beside so many beds there, had read the newspaper to so many people, and there were some whose faces she couldn't remember after they were gone. She said it like an apology, and she heard her voice break at the end. He said he knew. He said he didn't expect her to remember. Then he went on, still in that same even voice, and said there was a list circulated every month among the people who did the kind of work she had seen in the room behind the restaurant, a dry list of names and addresses meant to keep them from getting in one another's way. He said that on Tuesday morning, someone read that list and stopped at one line. He said the name on that line was hers. He said he had driven himself to Brighton. Camille stood frozen in the middle of the lawn. She thought of that morning, of the 2 vehicles blocking the drive, of the 4 men standing there waiting, of the way his eyes had moved from her face to the frayed cuff of her sleeve and back again, a look she had mistaken for the appraisal of a man inspecting merchandise. And she understood that he hadn't been inspecting anything. He had been confirming. He had been looking to make sure it was really her. Camille asked if he had known her before that day. He didn't answer directly. He only said he had come to her yard that morning because he saw her name on the paper, and he knew exactly who she was. Then he added one more sentence, the only one all evening in which his voice sounded different. He said that for an entire year, he had paid for that room, but she was the one who had sat inside it. Camille couldn't speak. Tears ran down her face, and she let them fall. He didn't come closer. He didn't reach out. He simply opened the car door, paused for a moment, then told her to keep the keys, and drove away. The faucet in the kitchen of that apartment had leaked from the very first day. Camille had tied a towel around its neck and set a bowl underneath to catch the water, and she had grown so used to the dripping that some nights she woke up because it had stopped. She didn't call anyone. She didn't know who to call, and she didn't want one more thing done for her. Then one Saturday afternoon there was a knock at the door, and he stood there with a small canvas bag in his hand. He didn't ask how she was living. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He only said the building manager had reported a leak in an apartment on the 2nd floor, and he walked straight into the kitchen. Camille watched him take off his coat and drape it over the back of a chair, roll up his sleeves, and lie flat on the floor so he could slide his head into the cabinet beneath the sink. She was about to say she could do it herself. Then she stopped. She leaned against the kitchen doorway for a while, listening to the wrench strike the pipes, then set a pot on the stove and boiled some water. She didn't ask if he wanted to eat. She simply made 2 bowls of the cheap noodles she bought at the corner store, adding an egg and a little green onion to each one. When he crawled out from beneath the sink and turned the faucet to test it, the water ran smoothly without dripping, and he washed his hands under that stream for a long time. Then he sat down at the table. The 2 of them ate their noodles in silence. The table was unsteady, pushed against the wall, with barely enough room for 2 bowls. He finished everything. He didn't praise the food, didn't thank her, didn't say anything at all, and Camille realized she felt relieved by that. Afterward, she poured water for both of them, and they remained at the table until, at some point, she heard her own voice rise into the silence. She said the man who was supposed to marry her had picked up his bag and left the night he learned that debt existed. That was all. She didn't say his name, didn't tell him what the man had said, didn't tell him how long she had stood in the bedroom doorway after the sound of his car faded into the distance. He didn't ask for more. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't tell her she deserved better. He simply sat there in silence, looking down at the glass of water before him, and Camille realized this was the first time anyone had listened to her tell that story without immediately trying to mend it with some kind of sentence. Outside, the sky slowly darkened, and neither of them turned on the light. A long while later, Camille said people called him the devil. She didn't say it as an accusation. She said it like someone setting an object on the table, so they could both look at it. He didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He turned the glass in a slow circle against the tabletop, then said they were half right. Camille asked about the other half. He said the other half was what he was trying to take apart piece by piece, and then he added that tearing down a house took much longer than building one, because when it was built, no one was living inside it. But when it was torn down, someone was. Camille asked nothing else. She thought of the envelope on the long table, of the young man gripping it between both palms, of the older man pushing in his own chair before walking out. She thought she had seen both halves of him in the same afternoon, and she was still sitting here. He rose first, put on his coat, and picked up the canvas bag. At the door, he paused and told her that if anything else broke, she should tell the building manager. Camille said she would. They both knew she wouldn't, and that he would come again. She closed the door, returned to the kitchen, and stood there listening to the faucet that no longer dripped. The common hour at Rosewood Manor began after lunch, when the chairs were arranged in a semicircle around the old piano no one played anymore and the radio was turned on for those who wanted music. Camille was pouring water for Mr. Fenwick at a table near the window when she heard the front door open and looked up. 3 men entered the lobby. They wore long coats, their hair neatly combed, and the man in the middle carried a bouquet of daisies wrapped in cellophane. They didn't look around like strangers. They stopped at the reception desk, asked something, and the attendant pointed toward the common room. Camille set down the water pitcher. The man in the middle walked in, smiled, and greeted the whole room in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He said they represented an organization looking into care facilities in the region, that they had only stopped by for a visit, and he set the bouquet on top of the piano. Then he turned to Camille and called her by her full name, not the name on the badge pinned to her chest, her first and last name. He asked if she was the caregiver responsible for the Eastern Wing, how long she had worked there, and whether she found the work difficult. Camille answered each question in an ordinary voice, and she could hear the blood rushing in her ears. The second man walked slowly along the curve of chairs, looking into each face with his hands clasped behind his back. The third remained by the door. The man in the middle asked her one more question. He asked whether she had received any visitors there lately, anyone who had come to see her, and he asked it with the expression of a man inquiring about the weather. Camille understood at once that they hadn't come about money. They didn't mention the paper, didn't mention Yvonne, didn't mention Brayton. They had come to see whether she stood straight or trembled, whether she glanced toward the door, whether the name they had never spoken would change her face. She stood still. She didn't answer. The man in the middle smiled and said he understood, that he was only curious, and he stepped closer. Then came the sound of a chair scraping backward across the vinyl floor. Adelaide Quinn rose to her feet. She stood slowly, bracing one hand against the arm of the chair, and the entire room turned to look at her. She didn't look at Camille. She looked straight at the man who had brought the flowers, and said in a voice that was perfectly clear, clearer than anything she had said in months, that this was her home, that she hadn't invited anyone there today, and that she wanted them to leave. The man stopped short. He opened his mouth to say something. Then came the sound of a second chair. Mr. Fenwick placed both hands on the arms of his chair and slowly pushed himself to his feet without saying a word. Then Mrs. Hetty stood. Then Mr. Pruitt, who usually took the entire morning to agree to leave his bed. Then another person at the far end of the room. Then two more. No one shouted. No one pointed. No one moved toward them. One by one, they simply rose from their chairs. More than a dozen people, with silver hair, some leaning on walkers, some trembling so badly they had to hold on to the shoulder of the person beside them, and they stood there looking at the three men in long coats. The radio was still playing an old song. No one turned it off. The man in the middle looked around the room. The smile remained on his face, but it had become something else. He said they were sorry for disturbing their rest, that they would return another time, and the three men turned and left. The front door closed behind them. The bouquet of daisies remained on top of the piano. Camille stood in the middle of the room with both hands shaking violently, then went from chair to chair, helping each person sit down, unable to say anything except the same words over and over. "Please sit down. I'm here. Please sit down now." When she reached Adelaide, the old woman had already settled back into her chair and was gazing out the window, her eyes distant again as they were every day, as though the woman who had just stood up hadn't been her at all. The next morning, a notice appeared on the bulletin board beside the staff lounge. The planned merger of Rosewood Manor with a healthcare corporation, the subject of rumors throughout the home all winter, had been cancelled without explanation. Beneath it was a second notice announcing that an additional overnight security shift would begin that week. Camille read both notices twice. She asked no one about them. She simply turned away and pushed the medication cart down the eastern corridor, as she did every morning. Camille found her through the woman who had cut Yvonne's hair for years at the salon on Main Street. Yvonne was staying at a motel beside the highway north of town. A single row of ground-floor rooms stretching along the parking lot beneath a sign with one burned-out letter. Camille knocked on the door of the last room late one afternoon, and Yvonne opened it with the safety chain still fastened, peering through the narrow gap before unhooking it and stepping back without a word. The room smelled of old cigarette smoke. On the table beside the bed sat an open box of cookies, an ashtray, and a stack of papers, bound with a rubber band. Camille stood in the middle of the room. She didn't sit down. She said she had come to ask one question, and would leave as soon as she had an answer. She asked Yvonne who she had borrowed the money from, and when she had borrowed it. Yvonne sat on the edge of the bed and stared down at her hands for a long time. Then she said she hadn't borrowed anything. Camille said she had seen Yvonne's signature on the paper. Yvonne said her signature had been added afterward, as the person confirming and accepting something that already existed. Then she pulled the stack of papers closer, removed the rubber band, and took out a document from near the bottom. She didn't hand it to Camille. She placed it on the table and turned it around so Camille could see. Camille stepped closer. The paper had yellowed around the edges. At the top was the name of a lending company she had never heard of. At the bottom, in the box reserved for the borrower, was a signature. Camille recognized it instantly, and at the same moment she didn't recognize it at all. It was her father's name, but the handwriting trembled. The letters separated from one another, and the final letter slipped beneath the line and trailed into a long mark that reached the edge of the page. Yvonne said he had signed it in his hospital room. She said the insurance company had refused to pay for his final course of treatment, and he hadn't told Camille because she was working 2 jobs at the time, and he knew she would quit both of them to stay beside him. She said he called them that morning, and someone brought the papers that very afternoon. She said she had stood at the foot of the bed. She said he had to grip the pen 3 times before he managed to write. Then Yvonne pointed to the lower portion of the document, to the section printed in small letters beneath a heading about the guarantor. In that box was a name written in the same hand, Camille Whitaker. Camille stood staring at her own name on the yellowed paper, and for a length of time she couldn't measure. She heard nothing at all. She thought of the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle in the church parking lot. She thought of the evenings he had sat at the kitchen table, adding the bills again and again before telling her not to worry. She thought of the picture frame with a crack running diagonally across his face, lying at the bottom of the black plastic bag, and she understood that the first person to put a price on her in writing hadn't been Yvonne, hadn't been the debt collector, hadn't been anyone standing in that yard on Tuesday morning. It had been him. The one person she had never doubted once in her entire life. Camille didn't scream. She placed both hands on the table to steady herself. Then she asked Yvonne a single question. She asked why Yvonne had never told her all these years. Yvonne was silent for a long time. Then she said she had meant to tell her. She said she had meant to do it every year. She said that once she had sat at the kitchen table all evening waiting, and Camille came home when it was nearly dawn, still wearing her uniform, and stood at the sink drinking straight from the faucet because she was too tired even to reach for a glass, then went into her room and fell asleep. Yvonne said she had remained at the table, staring at the faucet Camille hadn't shut off completely. She said she meant to tell her again the following year and saw the same thing happen. Then again the year after that. She said every time she opened her mouth, she thought that if the girl knew, she would carry the burden, and she would keep carrying it until she broke. So Yvonne stayed silent. She said she had believed her silence was protecting Camille. Then she said one final thing, her voice very quiet. She said she had been wrong from the first year, and every year after that she had only laid another layer of wrong over the one before it, until it became so thick she could no longer see a way out. Camille stood there. Outside, trucks passed along the highway, their headlights sweeping across the thin curtains. She didn't tell Yvonne that she forgave her. She didn't tell her that she didn't. She only asked one more question. She asked how many copies of the paper existed. Yvonne said this was the original, and that she had kept it ever since the day he died. Yvonne didn't give her the original. She said she needed to keep it. And when Camille asked what for, she only shook her head and refused to answer. But she allowed Camille to photograph the entire stack of papers, one page at a time, beneath the yellow light of the motel room, and she even read aloud several lines of fine print that Camille's phone couldn't capture clearly, so Camille could write them down. 3 days later, Camille sat in a small room on the ground floor of the county's old administrative building, where a wooden sign identified it as a free legal aid office, and a row of plastic chairs lined the wall for those waiting. The woman who met with her was named Frances Duval. Her shoulder-length hair was streaked with gray, and she wore 2 pairs of glasses, one perched on her nose and the other pushed up onto her forehead. She took the printed documents from Camille, asked whether Camille minded if she read first and spoke afterward, then read in silence for nearly 20 minutes. Camille watched her turn each page. Several times she went back to an earlier page, compared 2 pages side by side, then made a pencil mark in the margin. When she finished, Mrs. Duval removed her glasses and asked whether Camille knew the amount of the original loan. Camille told her how much her father had borrowed. Mrs. Duval tapped a finger against the final page and said the amount they were demanding from Camille now was many times greater, and the difference wasn't money her father had borrowed, but a series of fees piled one on top of another. She pointed to each line and explained. She said this was a late payment penalty charged every month. She said this was compounded interest, calculated on the penalties as well as the principal, which meant that every month the old penalties generated new interest. She said this was an account management fee, and this was a transfer fee charged each time the debt was sold to another company. She said that charging interest on penalties in this manner already exceeded the limit allowed under state law, and that a civil court could declare the excessive portion invalid even if the original loan itself was lawful. Camille asked whether that meant she still owed the principal. Mrs. Duval said the principal was the borrower's responsibility, and the borrower was Camille's father, not Camille. She said a guarantor clause was binding only if the person named in it knew about it and agreed, not when someone else simply wrote that person's name into a box. Then she set down her pen and came to the most important part. She said that no matter whether the debt was valid or invalid, large or small, there was one thing that could never lawfully happen. She said a monetary debt couldn't be transformed into an obligation to work. She said the paper Camille's stepmother had signed that morning, the one stating that Camille had to work for those people until the debt was paid off, wasn't an employment contract and wasn't a civil agreement. She said it had a name of its own under federal law, and that name was human trafficking. She said there didn't have to be chains, and no one had to be locked away. Using debt to force a person to work was enough. Camille sat in silence. Mrs. Duval went on to say that the law classified a person in such circumstances as a victim, not an offender, that victims had the right to protection, the right to help finding housing, and that they didn't have to pay any fee for that help. She said support lines operated throughout the night, that offices like this one existed in counties everywhere, and that no one was ever required to file a report alone. Then she looked across the table at Camille and said one final thing. She said Camille didn't owe those people a single penny. She said the only thing Camille still owed was an apology, and she owed it to herself for the time she had spent believing she deserved to be treated that way. Camille walked out of the building at noon. She stopped on the stone steps with the stack of papers held against her chest and thought about how, for so many years, she had lived like someone paying a price she had never been asked to accept. No one in this world had the right to write down the price of a human being on a piece of paper. She had believed that while standing in the empty apartment. Now she knew the law believed it too. The pain began around midnight, dull and low, and Camille lay still in the darkness, trying to convince herself it would pass. She'd worked a double shift that day. She'd spent 8 hours on her feet, then another 4 cleaning offices. She told herself it was from standing too long. She drank some water, lay on her side, and counted backward from 100. By about 1 o'clock in the morning, she sat up and couldn't straighten her body. She reached for her phone. She stared at the screen for a long time. She had no one to call. Adelaide was sleeping somewhere several miles away and couldn't remember what day it was. Yvonne was in a room that smelled of stale cigarettes. The man who was supposed to marry her had driven away during the winter. And then she thought of the number the building manager had given her on the day she moved in. The number she'd saved while telling herself she would never use it. She called. He answered on the second ring. She managed to say only a few words. He didn't ask another question. He simply said he was coming, then ended the call. Camille sat on the floor beside the bed with her back against the frame, and she heard a car stop on the street far sooner than she'd expected. He didn't knock. The door opened, and he walked straight inside. He didn't ask where it hurt, didn't ask whether she was all right, and didn't offer a single word of comfort. He simply draped his coat over her shoulders, helped her to her feet, and guided her down the stairs one step at a time, moving at exactly the pace she could manage. In the car, he didn't turn on the radio or speak. He drove quickly but with perfect steadiness, and once, when she drew a breath through her mouth, she saw his hands tighten around the steering wheel before relaxing again. At the emergency room, they took her inside. He remained outside. The hallway had a row of connected plastic chairs, a brightly lit vending machine, and a clock on the wall whose second hand made a quiet ticking sound in the night. He sat in the second chair from the door. He didn't go looking for anyone to question. He didn't take out his phone and call anyone. He didn't tell the nurse on duty who he was. Didn't offer the name that made an entire city lower its voice when speaking it. And didn't do any of the things he'd spent his life doing to make doors open faster. Because behind that door, there was no other door to open. There was no one to pressure. There was nothing to buy. He sat with both hands resting on his knees, staring directly at the wall opposite him, and waited. Once, someone hurried past, pushing a gurney, and he sprang to his feet before sitting down again. Once, the door opened, and a nurse came out, looked around, and called another person's name. He sat down again. The second hand kept ticking. Outside, the sky changed from black to gray. At dawn, a nurse stepped into the hallway and asked whether he was there with Miss Whittaker. He stood. She said everything was stable, that Miss Whittaker needed fluids and rest, that all her current readings were normal, and that the doctor had instructed her to reduce her workload. He listened to everything. He nodded. He asked whether he could go inside. The nurse said he could. Camille was lying on her side, awake, her eyes open. He pulled the plastic chair from the corner closer to the bed and sat down, and as he did, the left leg of his trousers rode upward. Camille saw it. A black plastic band encircled his ankle, with a thick little box attached to the outside, and a green light blinking very slowly. She looked at it, then raised her eyes to his face. He didn't pull down his trouser leg. He didn't explain. He never spoke a single word about it. Not that day, and not ever. He only looked back at her. And in that moment, Camille understood that when she'd called him at 1 o'clock in the morning, this man had known exactly what it would cost him to drive beyond the boundary, and he'd picked up his car keys before she'd even finished speaking. She reached one hand beyond the edge of the blanket. He didn't take it. He merely placed his own hand on the blanket beside hers, and they left them there until morning had fully arrived. He returned home shortly before noon. The house had many rooms, and not one of them held another living soul. He stood in the kitchen and ate on his feet, remembering what Bruno had told him long ago, that the man who occupied that chair wasn't allowed to have anything he could lose, and for the first time in many years, he did. 4 days later, there was a knock at the door in the evening. Camille was standing at the sink with her hands still wet. and she opened it without thinking because she'd grown accustomed to the building manager occasionally coming upstairs to check on her. Nolan Reyes stood in the hallway. He'd lost weight. He held his hat in both hands and twisted it between his fingers, and he said her name like a man testing whether it was still a name he was allowed to use. Camille didn't invite him inside. She stood blocking the doorway with one hand still wrapped around the doorknob and asked how he'd learned she was there. He said Brayton was a small place. He said one of the nurses in the emergency room had gone to school with his sister, then stopped, because they both understood the rest of the sentence. His eyes dropped toward her belly before quickly turning away. Then he began to speak. He said he'd spent weeks thinking. He said he'd panicked that night, that he was only in his early 20s, and when he saw that number, he saw his entire life being nailed to something he hadn't created. He said the debt wasn't his, and he said it twice, the second time more quietly than the first, as though even he could hear that something about those words was wrong. He said he'd made a mistake. He said he still had the ring, that he still kept it in a drawer. He said he could ask for his old job back, or find another place that paid more, that he would do it, that this time he would be there. He spoke quickly and at great length, and Camille allowed him to finish. She didn't interrupt him once. She stood there listening, and as she listened, she realized something very strange. She felt no pain in the place where she'd always imagined it would hurt. When he stopped and looked up to wait, she asked him one question. She asked where he'd been on that Tuesday morning at 7:14, when someone drilled through the lock on her apartment door, when a hand shoved her through the doorway, and when 4 men stood waiting in the courtyard. Nolan opened his mouth. He couldn't say anything. He looked down at the hat in his hands. Camille waited. She waited longer than necessary, not to punish him, but because she wanted to be certain she'd given him enough time. He couldn't answer. She nodded. Then she told him she wasn't angry with him. She said she'd been angry during the winter. So angry that there had been nights when she couldn't sleep, but that anger had disappeared long ago, and she couldn't find it again even if she wanted to. She said she'd spent 3 nights sleeping in her car. She said she'd stood inside a police station and listened while someone explained that there was nothing they could do. She said she'd passed through all of it, and she'd passed through it alone, and now she was standing on the other side. Then she spoke her final words. She said she didn't need him anymore. It wasn't that she didn't want him. She didn't need him. Nolan stood motionless. He said her name again, very softly. He said he was sorry. Camille said she believed him, and she meant it. Then she stepped back half a pace and began closing the door, slowly and without slamming it, and he didn't reach out to stop her. The door closed. She remained there with her forehead resting against the wood, listening to his footsteps travel down the hallway, descend the stairs, and leave the building. Then she returned to the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and finished washing the dishes she'd left undone. Her hands didn't tremble. That was what surprised her most about the entire evening. Bruno Lazzari came to the room behind the restaurant one afternoon, without anyone summoning him. He'd served Massimo's father since before Massimo could walk, and among all the men who had ever gathered around that long table, he was the only one permitted to pull out a chair and sit without waiting. That afternoon, he didn't sit. He stood at the opposite end of the table, with both hands resting on the back of a chair, and said that the 3 men who had gone to the nursing home that day had been sent because of him. Massimo said nothing. Bruno continued. He said that the list sent out each month, the list containing a line with Camille Whitaker's name, had passed through his hands first, and that he'd been the one who called Massimo that Tuesday morning. He said he'd done it because he recognized the name. Then he said that afterward, when Massimo drove himself to Brayton and tore up the paper in front of Kestrel's men, Gennaro Sabatini had called him. He said Sabatini asked only one question: who was that girl to the boy? And Bruno said he'd answered. Massimo still said nothing. He remained seated at the head of the table, with both hands resting on the wood, looking at the 66-year-old man standing opposite him. Bruno pulled out the chair, sat down very slowly, and said he would tell the rest, because if he didn't tell it that day, he never would. He asked whether Massimo remembered the autumn when Sabatini was expelled from the family. Massimo said he did. Bruno asked whether he remembered who had signed the order. Massimo said he'd always believed it was his father. Bruno nodded and said yes. His father had signed it. Then he said Massimo's father had signed that order in this very room, in the exact chair where Massimo was sitting now, and after signing it, he'd handed it to someone and told that person to retrieve the keys. Bruno said he'd been that person. He said he'd driven to Sabatini's house that night. He said Sabatini's wife had answered the door, and understood why he was there the moment she saw the paper in his hand. He said he'd stood on their porch and read the order aloud because that was the rule. And he still remembered Sabatini standing in the middle of his own living room, listening from beginning to end. He said that when Bruno left carrying the keys, Sabatini hadn't said anything about Massimo's father. He'd spoken to Bruno. He'd called Bruno by name. Bruno sat in silence for a while before speaking the words. He said Sabatini had never hated Massimo. He hated Bruno. He said Sabatini had been waiting all those years, and what he wanted wasn't money or territory. He wanted to see Bruno forced to do exactly what he'd done that night, to stand in the middle and betray one of his own. He said Sabatini had found a way. He said that when the man called, he hadn't threatened Bruno once. He'd only said Bruno could choose silence, and Bruno hadn't chosen it. Massimo asked why. Bruno said he'd told himself he was answering to keep the situation from escalating, that he was giving away one harmless sentence in exchange for peace throughout the family. Then he said those were the words he'd repeated to himself while driving home, and he'd managed to believe them for exactly 3 days. He said the truth was that he'd been afraid. He said he'd lived with that fear for all those years without ever daring to name it. Then he spoke his final sentence, his voice turning hoarse, saying that one night he'd signed his name on a piece of paper, and many years later, that paper had returned to collect its debt. No one else was in the room. The low light above the table hummed. Massimo remained silent for so long that Bruno began reaching into his coat pocket to remove his ring of keys. Massimo didn't allow him to do it. He only told Bruno to go home. Bruno looked up, not understanding. He asked Massimo to repeat himself. Massimo said it again in the same voice, telling him to go home, that his wife was waiting for him to have dinner, and that Massimo never wanted to hear about this matter again. Bruno stood. He remained there for a moment, as though waiting for something else to come, and when it didn't, he walked out slowly, steadying himself against the back of each chair on his way to the door. Massimo was still seated at the head of the table when the phone in his pocket vibrated. A message from a number he hadn't saved. It contained the name of a hotel that had closed long ago on the edge of town, an address, and a line saying that Mrs. Whitaker was there, and that she'd gone there willingly. Massimo called Camille and told her to remain inside, lock the door, and open it for no one. He spoke very briefly, and ended the call before she could answer. Camille stood in the middle of the kitchen with the phone in her hand, and she understood at once that the only name capable of making him call at that hour was her stepmother's. She called him back. He didn't answer. She called again, then put on her coat, took her car keys, and sent him exactly one line before starting the engine. She wrote that throughout her life, she'd always been the person taken away, the person others signed for, the person others made decisions for, and that this time, she was going by her own choice. The Bellamy Hotel stood at the edge of town, a 3-story building that had been closed for years, with paper covering the lobby's glass doors and weeds growing through the cracks in the parking lot. A faint light shone from inside. Camille parked some distance away and entered through a side door that had been left partly open. The hotel lobby was large and empty, with a high ceiling, a dust-covered chandelier hanging overhead, and 2 bare light bulbs someone had temporarily suspended from a beam. In the middle of the lobby stood a chair. Yvonne was sitting in it. She wasn't tied up. No one stood guard over her. She sat with her back straight and her purse resting in her lap. And when she saw Camille enter, her face collapsed, and she told her to go home immediately. Gennaro Sabatini stood several steps away. He was older than Camille had imagined, with white hair combed straight back, and in one hand he held a sheet of paper whose edges had yellowed with age. He greeted her very politely. He said the woman had come there on her own, without being invited. He said she'd arrived that afternoon, sat down in that chair, and placed a document on the table that she believed was a bargaining chip. Then he held it up so Camille could see the trembling signature at the bottom. He said Yvonne intended to trade it for their promise to leave Camille alone. He said she hadn't even asked what he wanted before placing it on the table. Camille looked at her stepmother. Yvonne lowered her head. She said she'd thought that if she gave them the document, they wouldn't have anything left to use. She said she'd spent the entire morning thinking it through. She said she'd never been good at things like this. Camille stepped forward and told Sabatini to say what he wanted. He laughed and said she'd misunderstood, that he didn't want anything from her and never had, that she'd merely happened to stand in the path of something that had begun before she was born. Then the side door opened. Massimo entered alone. He hadn't brought anyone with him. He walked directly into the center of the lobby, stopped some distance from Sabatini, then took the phone from his coat pocket, and held it up so the other man could see the illuminated screen and the recording bar moving steadily across it before placing it on the dust-covered reception counter. He said everything from that moment forward was being recorded. He said he'd come to hear Sabatini speak the words he'd waited so many years to say. Sabatini looked at the phone, then at Massimo. His smile vanished. He said the boy was exactly like his father, always imagining he was sitting in a courtroom. Then he began to speak, and he spoke at great length about an autumn night, a front porch, and an order read aloud in front of his wife. He said Bruno Lazzari's name 3 times. Camille stepped backward and saw 2 men at the far end of the lobby begin moving toward Massimo. Then everything happened very quickly. There was the sound of feet running across the tile. A table was overturned, followed by the long scrape of wood sliding across the floor. One of the 2 bare bulbs was torn from the beam and went dark, plunging half the lobby into shadow. Camille heard a heavy collision somewhere beyond her, heard someone fall, heard harsh breathing very close by. When the table overturned, Sabatini dropped the paper onto the tile to draw his weapon. In the shadows, Yvonne dropped to her knees, snatched the document from the floor, folded it, and crammed it into her coat pocket. Then came a sudden silence, one that lasted only the length of a heartbeat, and within that silence, Camille saw that Sabatini had turned around and raised his hand, and what he held was no longer the paper. He wasn't aiming it at Massimo. He was aiming it at her. Camille had no time to think. She heard only the chair falling, and before she understood what was happening, Yvonne had sprung from her seat and thrown herself directly in front of Camille, both arms spread wide, her back turned toward her stepdaughter, shielding her completely. Camille didn't remember the sound. Later, whenever she tried to recall it, all she could remember was the silence immediately afterward, and that Yvonne's back remained in front of her for one more heartbeat before it was no longer there. Then Camille's hands were holding her stepmother by the shoulders. She lowered herself to the tile floor with her, slowly, because Yvonne was heavier than she'd expected, and rested the woman's head in her lap. Only one light remained in the lobby, a bare bulb hanging on the far side, and its glow didn't reach them. Camille looked down. She saw Yvonne's face. She saw the wrinkles around her mouth, something she'd looked at for so many years without ever truly seeing. She saw Yvonne trying to open her eyes wider, trying to find Camille's face in the darkness. Camille heard her own voice calling to her, and heard it break on the very first word. Yvonne found her. She released a breath, and one corner of her mouth lifted slightly, and she asked whether Camille was all right. Camille nodded, quickly, again and again. And in that exact moment, without being summoned, a winter evening surfaced on its own. Camille was little, burning with a fever so high that her entire body felt hot and her ears rang. The old car in the driveway wouldn't start. Each turn of the key produced only a dry clicking sound before it fell silent again. Yvonne wrapped the girl in a blanket, lifted her onto her back, and began walking. The snow reached her ankles. The streetlights stood far apart, and the spaces between them were completely dark. Camille remembered pressing her face into the collar of Yvonne's coat and listening to her breathing, heavy and steady, and remembered how every time Yvonne stumbled on the ice, her arms tightened around the girl's legs. She walked that way all the way to the clinic at the end of Main Street. Camille had never spoken of that night to anyone. She didn't know why it had returned to her now. On the tile floor of the Bellamy Hotel, Yvonne moved her right hand. She was trying to retrieve something from inside her clothing. Camille reached down to help, and Yvonne pulled out an envelope folded into quarters, its creases worn, its edges faded to ivory. She pressed it into Camille's palm. Then she took that hand and folded Camille's fingers around the envelope one by one, the way someone teaches a child to hold tightly to something they mustn't drop. She told Camille to keep it. She told her not to let anyone take it. Camille bent closer. Yvonne looked up at her face for a long time, and when she spoke again, her voice was much weaker, though every word remained clear. She said she wasn't asking Camille to forgive her. She said she knew she had no right to ask for that. Then she paused to draw another breath. Her hand still rested over Camille's. She said she was asking only one thing. She told Camille not to let the child grow up in a home like hers. Camille opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again, and still there was nothing. Her throat had closed, and everything she wanted to say remained trapped there. All the questions from all those years, all the words she'd rehearsed inside her mind while driving to the roadside motel that day. Every one of them lay still and refused to emerge. So she only nodded. She nodded once, then again, and held Yvonne's hand tightly between both of hers. Yvonne looked at her. She didn't say anything more. The lines around her mouth relaxed, and she looked up at the high ceiling of the hotel lobby, as though she were looking at something very far away. And after a while, the hand inside Camille's became lighter. Camille bent forward until her forehead touched Yvonne's, and she remained that way on the cold tile floor. Outside, sirens sounded in the distance and drew closer. The envelope folded into quarters remained in her hand, her fingers still closed around it exactly as Yvonne had folded them. On the far side of the lobby, everything had ended before Camille even raised her head. One of Sabatini's 2 men had lunged at him and tried to wrestle control of his hand, and in the struggle, they both crashed into the edge of the dust-covered reception counter. Wood broke. The gun slipped from Sabatini's hand and flew across the tile, spinning twice before stopping in the open space at the center of the lobby. Sabatini fell beside the counter and couldn't rise. He braced one hand against the floor, breathing heavily, his silver hair fallen loose across his forehead, and looked up. The other 2 men had stepped back. No one moved toward the gun. No one dared. Massimo walked forward. He passed the overturned table, crossed the darkness beyond the reach of the remaining light, and bent down to pick up the gun. Then he straightened. The entire lobby fell completely silent. Sabatini sat on the floor several steps away. The 2 men stood against the wall. Behind them, Camille sat on the tile with her stepmother's head in her lap and the envelope folded into quarters in her hand, and she looked up. Every person in that room was watching the same place, and every one of them was waiting for the same thing. Massimo didn't move. He stood with the gun in his hand, its barrel pointed toward the floor, and looked down at the silver-haired man sitting beside the counter. He'd stood in this position before, not in this room and not with this man, but he'd occupied that exact place more times than he wanted to remember. And each time, everyone around him had known what came next. And each time, they'd been right. That was what his name meant. That was why the debt collector in the Brayton courtyard had removed his hat before he had time to think. Sabatini looked at him and began to laugh, a hoarse and broken sound. He told Massimo to do it. He said Massimo had been waiting for this his entire life. He said to do it, and then he would understand whose son he was. Massimo didn't answer. Sirens sounded on the road outside, still distant but drawing closer. He remained where he was. He stood there long enough for one of the 2 men against the wall to shift his weight. He stood there long enough for Camille to hear her own breathing clearly, and within that silence, he turned his head. He didn't look at Sabatini. He looked toward the far end of the lobby, where a woman sat on the cold tile, holding a hand that had gone cold inside her own. He looked at Camille for a long time. Then he turned back. He held the gun in both hands. He removed the magazine, and the sound of metal separating from metal rang with perfect clarity through the empty lobby. He pulled back the slide, and a cartridge flew free, struck the tile, rolled away, and stopped. Then he bent down and placed the gun on the floor in front of him. He straightened and pushed it away with the toe of his shoe, and it slid across the center of the lobby, passed beyond the light, and came to rest somewhere in the darkness, far from everyone. Sabatini stopped laughing. Massimo walked to the reception counter, picked up the phone that was still recording, and said into it that an ambulance was needed at that address immediately. He read out the address. He said 2 people were injured. Then he ended the call and stood there. Sabatini looked at him with the expression of a man who had just been deprived of something he'd preserved for many years. He asked why. He asked again, his voice rising. Massimo looked down at him and answered in the same ordinary voice he used when speaking about the weather. He said that if he pulled the trigger, Sabatini won. He said Sabatini had waited all those years to see one person traded for something else. And if Massimo did what everyone in that room expected him to do, then Camille would forever remain nothing more than an object 2 men had exchanged between them. He said he was no longer taking part in that. Then he turned his back on Sabatini, crossed the center of the lobby, and walked toward the far end where Camille sat. He didn't say anything to her. He removed his coat and laid it over Yvonne, drawing it carefully up to her shoulders, the way someone covers a sleeping person with a blanket. Then he sat down on the tile beside Camille and remained there. The sirens had reached the parking lot, and red and blue light began sweeping across the paper-covered windows of the lobby. The trial began in late spring, and the person who entered the courtroom carrying the envelope folded into quarters wasn't a lawyer, a police officer, or the man whose name had once made an entire city lower its voice. It was Camille. She placed the original document on the table before the panel. The paper yellowed at the edges, and bearing the trembling signature of a man who had been in the ground for many years, and she stated clearly that this was what her stepmother had kept all that time and carried with her to the Bellamy Hotel. From that document, investigators traced an entire system. Mrs. Frances Duval sat in the back row and merely smiled when Camille walked past her. Kestrel Recovery Group was exposed within weeks. Hundreds of files were brought into the light. The people being forced to work off their debts at various facilities were removed and given housing assistance, and every one of those labor agreements was declared void, without any remaining legal force. But one thing didn't change. Massimo's plea agreement had been negotiated before that morning in the Brayton courtyard, and it had nothing to do with Sabatini. It concerned the years he'd spent inheriting and running something he hadn't chosen but had agreed to take charge of. His cooperation reduced his sentence. It didn't erase it. Camille sat in the third row on the day the sentence was pronounced. She didn't say a word. When he turned to look for her, she merely placed a hand over her belly where he could see it, and he gave her one very slight nod, that same familiar nod, before being led inside. That winter, Camille gave birth to a daughter. She named her Josephine after the mother whose face she could no longer remember, though she still remembered the scent of her hair. Mrs. Adelaide Quinn died the following spring in her sleep, in the room at the end of the eastern hallway. Camille was given an envelope Adelaide had asked someone to keep for her, and across it, in the trembling handwriting of a very old hand, were the words, "For my Josephine." Camille sat on the steps behind the nursing home and cried for a long time, and it was the first time she'd cried since the night at the Bellamy Hotel. Inside the envelope was everything the old woman had left in the world, along with a note saying she wanted the money used to create a place where elderly people were called by their proper names. Then, that summer, Camille received a call from a lawyer she'd never met. Before reporting to serve his sentence, Massimo had established a trust in the child's name. He hadn't said a word to Camille about it, but what made her sit down was a provision he'd written into the final section with his own hand. One the lawyer had to read aloud twice because Camille said she must have heard it wrong. It stated that neither the beneficiary nor the beneficiary's guardian had any obligation to meet, contact, answer, or even acknowledge the existence of the person who created the trust, and that refusing all or any portion of it would carry no consequences whatsoever. Camille remained seated in silence for a long time after the call ended, because she understood that he'd given her exactly one thing, the same thing he'd given her in the courtyard at 7:14 on that Tuesday morning, when he held the contract in his hand and asked whether she was signing it of her own free will, the right to refuse. Many years later, he was released from prison. He didn't call. He didn't come looking for her. He didn't send a single line. Camille was the one who drove to find him. Adelaide House stood at the edge of Brayton in a renovated old brick building, and it didn't belong to any corporation. Camille was the director of nursing there. One September afternoon, she stood at the end of the hallway holding Josie, who was busy tugging at her mother's collar, and looked down the row of open doors. In the first room, a young employee was calling Mrs. Hetty by her proper name. In the third, someone was reading the newspaper aloud to an elderly man, including the classified advertisements. At the end of the hallway, a man whose hair had turned gray was holding a wrench and repairing the faucet in the common room, and he didn't look up because he'd grown accustomed to no one paying attention to him there anymore. Camille stood watching for a long time. Some things require an entire lifetime to understand, and Mrs. Adelaide had once told her that if someone wrote a price on her, she should find the person holding the pen instead of questioning the mirror. No one in this world has the right to write a person's price on a piece of paper. Not the borrower, not the lender, not a relative, not a stranger, not anyone. And a person's true worth isn't found in a number someone else writes down. It is found in the way that person treats those who can never repay them. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like, share this video with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to meaningful stories together every day. How do you feel about Camille, Mrs. Adelaide, and the man who chose to lay everything down? Please leave a comment below, because we sincerely want to hear what you feel in the deepest part of your heart. May you and your family always enjoy good health and live each day in happiness and peace. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.